Hello and welcome into the Fog.net podcast. My name is Michael Swain, the Kansas beat writer for 24/7 Sports. After a little holiday break, Kevin Flaherty and I are back to discuss the Guaranteed Rate Bowl. We'll talk about the bowl game, the experience for the KU players, and maybe touch on a couple things with the KU offseason. But Kevin, I think we're in offseason mode now, so we've got to ration what we're talking about here with Kansas football. So today, let's talk a lot about the bowl game, what we saw
Yeah.
on the field, what it means for KU next year. We can hit a lot of the portal stuff, whether it be incomings, outgoings. Next week, as we are recording this on Tuesday, January 2nd, it's about 10:30 a.m. Spencer Lovell has just gone in the portal, but again, we'll talk about this stuff later because the portal does technically close today, but there's kind of a 48-hour window where things can still be in the works of the paperwork being processed and all that. So we're gonna wait till Sunday to hit on the portal stuff. But Kevin, holiday season, I was
Yeah.
able to go to California and get some warm weather. How was your holiday season?
Yeah, quick.
Yeah.
We usually go down to see my wife's family in Oklahoma because
Mhm.
of some work things for her. Like we wound up driving down the day of Christmas Eve and driving back Christmas later that day. So that was a day with a lot of driving, and then got to see my family Christmas Day and all that stuff up here in Kansas City. I have to ask, just about every Kansas person that I talked to who was going to Phoenix had a golf outing. Did you get any golf in when you went to the Guaranteed Rate Bowl?
No, and I'm bummed because of it. Kevin, this is kind of a theme of at least when I was thinking about the bowl game. Like, if it was 2 days later, if it was like December 28th, like it would have
Yeah.
been perfect because it would have been enough time to do that. For me, I flew in the day of the game. I think I
Yeah.
was on the first flight out of California, and got there day of the game, covered the game, went back, spent another day or two with family, and then flew back here. So it was an in and out trip. It was cool to see kind of what they did with KU for the bowl game. It was pretty cool. And look, Kevin, I'm so much of this bowl game looks so much better compared to Memphis of last year. Walking on the sideline before the game, chatting with different people, you could just sense that like people were much happier to be at this bowl game instead of the Liberty Bowl last year. Obviously, there was so much going on outside of the bowl game last year, right? No
Oh,
running
sure.
water. It was really cold. There were problems with the team hotel for KU. And this year it's so much smoother. And I think it's really cool that a lot of these guys who are seniors playing in their last bowl game got to experience like a very good one where they're treated well. They've got fun stuff to do. It's warm weather, and it seemed like the morale, I think, around just the program generally was really excited and really happy about the game. And Kevin, my morale, look, I'm going to say this sarcastically, but I'm bribable. I got nothing bad to say about the Guaranteed Rate Bowl. I'm bribable. I got a cool little water bottle that
All
they gave
right. There
media
you go.
members that's got the logo on it. Again, I'm bribable. So I got nothing but great things to say about the Guaranteed Rate Bowl. But I do feel like I need like a lot of these, like some flags to throw during this podcast to stop momentum. Got to turn off my mic so nobody can hear me and
Oh
talk
God.
about how someone committed a personal foul on something that actually didn't happen. Yeah, let's get this out of the way, Kevin.
All right. All right.
How hard was that to watch it on TV? Because I went back and rewatched the game, but I had the sound off. I like based on everything I saw on social media, it sounded like a disaster of a broadcast. So I
Yeah.
had it muted. Like, what'd you think watching it live?
Yeah. I mean, it was pretty rough. I think when you talk to a lot of Kansas fans about broadcasts that they don't enjoy, obviously ESPN Plus comes up a lot. They hate when basketball broadcasts get moved to ESPN Plus. Hate when football broadcasts get moved to ESPN Plus. And one of the common comments was, "This is worse than an ESPN Plus broadcast." And so I think when you look at all the different things, I think the commentators struggled a little bit. There were some really strange comments. I didn't know if you heard the one where the I think the color commentator made a comment about Devin Neal, who of course at that point had committed to come back to school, And he said, well, with a big bowl game in front of NFL scouts, maybe he winds up going. Devin Neal doesn't need more exposure. And the idea that, you know, a bowl game against UNLV, no matter what Devin Neal did, was going to make some NFL team sit up and notice that didn't already know about him is frankly absurd. But there was
Yeah.
there was a lot there was a lot of stuff like that where you're just kind of like, I don't know what they're seeing here. I don't know what they're thinking. Like you said, the refs mic was a real issue because I think a lot of people didn't know what was. I mean, they saw a flag. You could see the hand motions. You didn't know who it was on. You didn't know, what really was going on. And when it's penalty after penalty after penalty for a team that, quite frankly, wasn't very penalized this year, I
Mhm.
think that you add all of those factors together, and it wasn't a great viewing experience for people who weren't there.
Yeah, we're sitting in the press box, which is kind of like in the corner of the end zone behind UNLV. Um, like we couldn't hear anything in the stadium either, and it
Yeah,
was just weird to see. It seemed every play. It was like a basketball game. Kevin, you remember last year with some of the KU basketball games where in the second half there'd be 18 fouls called in 20
yeah,
minutes. Well, that's what this felt like, where neither team could really get some momentum going. But I will say, like, it's a bummer that the officiating was the way that it was because this was a fun game. Like,
yeah. You
you
had
look
two
at the
really fun offenses, and yeah,
yeah.
it should have been an absolute blast of a game, and obviously, I mean, Kansas fans are going to be happy with the result, but it could have been a much more fun experience, certainly, than it was.
Well, remember last year, Kevin, after the Liberty Bowl, how everyone's talking about, oh, well, outside of the playoff games, like this was the most exciting game
Yeah,
because of the comeback, because of the overtimes. And like this game would have been that if the flags hadn't been thrown and stopped the momentum of the game and really made it such a choppy contest. Because this, in terms of a football game, was really, really exciting. Like you look at what UNLV did on their first drive and the athleticism that they have at some of their skill positions. Obviously, I think KU's tackling was less than stellar, and that's something that I think is going to have to be resolved going into next year. Guys being in the right spot but not being able to tackle, that wasn't great. But I think just an end-to-end game where both teams had guys making plays. There's interceptions, there's turnovers, there's big throws, like it has everything that you want in a bowl game. And it's just a bummer that I think some of that gets taken away with the way that it was officiated and the lack of communication and all of those things. But I think we got to start by talking about Jason Bean because it's really cool for him that you think back to the bowl game last year, kind of the scapegoat, right? I think that was a lot of the conversation after the game was about Jason Bean, the throw, overthrowing it, the play call. And for him to be the one that is out here, throwing for 450 yards, basically, 6 touchdowns. Yes, there are 3 interceptions, but this was like a perfect way for Jason Bean to end his college career. And I think it's really cool because it caps a senior season that was really impactful.
yeah.
And it makes you wonder what happens if he's able to play the whole game against Texas Tech or the whole game against K State, because I think he was playing at such a high level at the end of the season. But this is just such a good way for him to cap his KU career.
Yeah, you got kind of the whole Jason Bean experience, didn't you? In terms of the big plays, you had the
Yeah.
turnovers in the middle of the game, but I think you can almost use the turnovers to show how much he'd grown, right? Because you look
Mm,
at I think the performance that it is most like from a statistical standpoint would be Oklahoma State, right? In terms of throwing for all these yards, throwing for all these touchdowns, having a few, really impactful turnovers. Against Oklahoma State, he didn't recover. Kansas didn't score what in the final 20 minutes or so of that game, whatever it was,
yeah.
and winds up losing a game that, quite frankly, Kansas should have won. And you look at this one, Kansas has, keep shooting itself in the foot with penalties. Bean has the turnovers. UNLV comes back. It's 28 to
Mm,
24 in heading into the fourth quarter, with Kansas facing a 4th and 1. Bean makes the long touchdown pass to Lawrence Arnold, which was huge, and then Bean was terrific the rest of the way. And I'm not sure that he has that positive response to adversity earlier in his career. And I think
Yeah,
that that really shows the growth level. And you know, it's interesting you talking about the bowl game last year because I do think some of that was at least slightly unfair. You know, everybody looks at a still photo
totally.
and they say, "Hey, you know, you missed this wide open wide receiver." What they don't see is from Jason Bean's point of view, there was a defender right in front of it. He couldn't see that guy. You know, yeah, we can
Yeah.
see him, but it wasn't an easy throw to make. And everybody says, "Oh, well, he should have run it." He should have either run it or put the ball in play because it was the final play. But at the same time, you're coming off the bench cold. You haven't thrown the ball all game. You know, you're all of a sudden in a potential game losing situation because if you make the play the game continues on. But to have all of that thrown on sort of one guy the way that it was, and then for him to respond and say, I can't go out like that. That can't be the end of my college career.
Mhm.
And come back, even knowing, hey, it's Jalen's job. It's, Jalen Daniels is the quarterback. He's the face of the program. Jalen's going to get all the kudos. He's going to get all the things. But I can't have my career end that way. And then to have it end the way that it did for him, it's Hallmark movie type stuff, to be honest with you. I mean, with all of that, and then the way that he grew throughout the season, and we've said it on this podcast before. I'll say it again. Jason Bean at the end of the regular season, in particular, when you look at Iowa State and Cincinnati, um, that's as good a quarterback play as Kansas has had since Todd Reesing. And I mean, Jalen's top moments would be in that category too. I'm not saying, Bean was better or Jalen was better. I'm saying in that moment,
Mm.
Bean didn't take anything off the table. He didn't put the football at risk. He was making big clutch plays with both his legs and his arm, and he was doing a lot of really positive things. And so to have it end the way that it did was just terrific.
Yeah, I think it's so much of it too reflects the senior class
Yeah.
because that's something that Lance Leipold has talked a lot about over the last 3 years. You know, when he got to KU, he discussed that there was an, "Oh, no, here we go again," feeling with a lot of the team when they'd get up or be close in a game and then something would go
Yeah.
wrong and guys would kinda shut down. And I think this game, Jason Bean, I think reflects so much of what has changed about KU, where I think over the course of this season in particular, you saw moments that KU got down in games and they rallied, and you saw moments that seemed to be slipping away from KU and they rallied. You can go to the Oklahoma game. I think you can go to Iowa State. When Iowa State comes out, they score, they make it close, and all of a sudden KU scores a long touchdown to Lawrence Arnold. Like there are these moments throughout the course of the season that showed the mental resiliency that this team had. And I think that moment in that kind of section of the game in the second half when UNLV started to make their run back into it before KU was able to kind of, calm things down, really get back to what they were doing and have success and be able to see out the rest of the game. I think it just speaks volumes to, I think, the culture and the way that this team is led by those older guys who have now been through this, and it's going to be on some of those kind of juniors next year to continue that, because I think that's one of the best things you can have in college football is, I think, the resiliency. I
Yeah.
think, Kevin, I don't know if you watched the game last night, but like Texas, Washington, like you saw
Yeah.
Texas kind of at the end of the game there when they need the defensive stops, kind of just start dropping their heads like, oh no, like this isn't going to happen for us. Like, you know, that says something about your culture and how you respond to things like that. So for KU, it speaks volumes about, I think, the people, right? The guys on the team and the work that they've done, that they've got the confidence to do it. So I think the way the game plays out is so cool for those seniors because those are the guys that help make this happen. So I think that was definitely an overwhelming positive that is a theme of the game. And I think the theme of kind of these first 3 years under Lance Leipold.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would even say, the two games that they lost with Cole Ballard playing quarterback most of the time, Texas
Mhm.
Tech, they're behind the eight ball with a quarterback who's never really played. They come
Yeah.
back and they tie that game late. And obviously, Tech goes down and gets the winning score. But I mean, it wasn't hanging their heads. They responded to resiliency and came back against
Mm.
Kansas State. They come back and they have a shot in the end zone to take the lead late. K-State winds up picking it off, obviously, and winning that game. But in both of those situations, even though they lost the game, they responded to adversity, and they gave themselves a chance at the end. I do have to ask, as somebody who was there, how apparent was Jason Bean's emotion after the game? I mean, in terms of the way that all of it ended, with him getting MVP of the bowl game and everything. What
Yeah.
was the emotion like that you got from him?
Well, I think of probably elation. That was one
Yeah,
of the ones,
sure.
that walking around the field after, I didn't really see what it was like in the immediate, as the UNLV guy tries to take a cheap shot at him. Like, I don't know
Yeah.
what the hell that was about. But he was he was the most popular guy post game. Like Jim Zabrowski came up, said, congratulations. But I mean, you got his own teammates asking for a photo with him and that trophy. I think it speaks to, Jason and what the teammates and the guys on the team think of him, that after a game like that, everyone's coming up to him and wanting to get a photo with him. You've got staffers, you've got players, coaches, like all different people kind of trying to get a little piece of the final performance of Jason Bean. So I think for him, it was being proud and excited. And even in the post-game press conference, it's still kind of the same level-headed guy that I think you saw, whether it be after a loss in the interviews he did or after a win in the interviews he did. It's always kind of even keel and the same kind of personality that shines through. So I think that was really cool just to see the comparison, how after, right, last year's bowl game, how the way it ended, to see him be kind of the most popular guy post game. I thought that was really neat and really cool to see. I think everyone kind of rally around him and understand that, hey, this is a really big moment for a guy that has had his ups and downs in college. And I think that is maybe a conversation we can have on the next podcast. We talk about the portal and the way things are changing, but I think Jason Bean is a great story for what college football should be.
Yeah.
The guy stays at a school, has ups and downs. He isn't always the starter. It isn't always his show, but when it is his time to be the guy, he steps up and he's ready to answer the bell. Like, that's cool. And I think that's something that's going to be lost in college football as guys start moving every year.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, moving on from Jason Bean, I
Mm-hmm.
think offensively, we were all interested to see, hey, what's this thing going to look like with Jim
Yeah.
Zabrowski as a play caller? I think UNLV lined up the way a lot of teams did against Kansas and basically said, we're going to put a bunch of guys in the box. You're not going to run the ball on us effectively, consistently, and we're going to dare you to beat us over the top. And guess what? Kansas beat UNLV over the top. And
Mm-hmm.
look at the play of the wide receivers. I think each of the three starters had a major highlight catch. When you think of Luke Grimm kind of winning the 50-50 ball down the field, the catch from Quentin Skinner, and obviously LJ Arnold getting the "you got mossed," play. But maybe the biggest play from the receiving core that probably doesn't get talked about enough, and it was one of the biggest plays of the game, was the block from Douglas Emilion on Devin Neal's 16-yard run on 3rd and 17, because Kansas is probably not going to go for that unless they're close. And Devin Neal goes the outside. Doug Emilion absolutely buries the defender inside that allows Neal to get 16 yards, make it a 4th and 1. And then on 4th and 1, Kansas calls a little play action bootleg, and that's where Arnold breaks totally clear for the touchdown. And
Yep.
if Emilion doesn't make that block, Devin Neal gets 6-7 yards maybe. They're probably punting that ball or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and instead it sets them up in a situation. And remember, they were only up 28-24 at that point, where if they're giving the ball back to UNLV, you're kind of like, I'm not feeling great about this right now. Instead, you get the touchdown, you get some breathing
Mm-hmm.
room. It's one of 3 touchdown passes from Jason Bean in the 4th quarter, and Kansas was kind of off at that point.
Totally. And I think wide receiver blocking, Kevin, you
Yeah.
remember some of the Les Miles teams and how those guys would not block for each other, and it'd be, a running back on the outside, and then all of a sudden, he's running, and then the wide receiver's kind of just jogging down the field, not doing much. Like, you watch the way that KU's wide receivers have been taught to block, right? You think about the job Terrence Samuel has done, And I think just generally the culture of, hey, we're all going to help each other. But I think for me, like, you want to talk about that, like the screen pass to Lawrence Arnold.
Yep.
Like, you've got Luke Grimm and Quentin Skinner both going to fight basically to
Yep.
make sure that their guy Lawrence Arnold can go and score a touchdown and get as many yards as possible. Like, those are the plays I think speak a lot about the culture, and it's something that Jeff Grimes, who I'll be interested to see what his Twitter game is like. I've seen some Dallas Cowboys tweets, but he tweeted that, hey, I'll read right here. In a very short time, I've seen that these dudes, parentheses, for me, the three amigos, if you're old enough to know, love each other and play for each other. This type of bond is special. And I agree. I think it's really cool that you've got guys that aren't sulking because they're not getting the targets or the receptions or the yards. Like, they're all out there fighting for each other and hoping and helping the team. So I think that's really cool. And you're right. Like, Douglas Emillion is going to go down. I don't know what his receiving numbers will be next year, but like, in my mind, he'll be the ultimate team player because the way he blocks, like, he loves
Yep.
to block, and you see it when every time he's on the field, they run to his side. Like, he's engaging with this guy and moving him back. And I think offensively for KU, that's such a positive thing to have that kind of team bond where guys aren't jealous of each other and they want to fight and keep going. So generally, though, Kevin, I want to ask you this. What did you think about the game plan that KU had and the way that Jim Zabrowski called the game? Because I was really impressed. I thought it was a really well
Yep.
called game. And I think at times maybe Jason Bean's decision making wasn't great on two of those interceptions. And I don't think you can control that with your play calling, but I thought it was a pretty well called game.
Yeah, and Kansas wound up being fairly balanced from a run pass standpoint in terms of,
Mm-hmm.
the plays that they called. Obviously, they were a lot more effective throwing the ball. But when you looked at it, I liked the fact that when they threw the ball, they were throwing with purpose, right? They were shot plays down the field. They really gave those receivers a chance to make plays, and I think, when you look at how they were able to scheme certain guys open. I liked the run to Quentin Skinner. I liked the screen pass to Lawrence Arnold. They did
Mm.
things to get some of these guys the ball in maybe ways that we aren't used to seeing them get the ball, and so I thought that was interesting. Obviously, because I think uh, as great as Andy Kotelnicki is, I think one of the takeaways with him is the fact that he was so creative, right? You were always kind of waiting to see, okay, like when Andy feels like he's in his bag, what's he going to call now? Whether it was putting, Armaj Reed Adams in the slot and then having him motion into run power, or, lining up the offensive line a certain way, or running this sort of trick play with motions and handoffs and things like
Mm.
that. Is Kansas still going to have that element when he goes? Because I think that with a lot of what Kansas does, it's pretty simple. They run wide zone, they run triple option concepts. They the passing concepts that they run aren't super complicated, but
Mm-hmm.
they dress it up in a lot of really creative ways. And I think, that's part of what makes this such an effective system. And so I think with Jeff Grimes coming in, you wanted to know, okay, we saw what Jeff Grimes did at Baylor. He may be a little bit different at Kansas, depending on personnel and things like that. I happen to think they'll still have some triple option in there because it's effective with what they do, with what Jalen does, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But with Zabrowski calling plays, one of the things that I wanted to see was the creativity, right? I wanted to see, is that still going to be in the room, even if it's not with the primary play caller? And I think that you did see that quite a bit. The other thing, and I think, we may see some Kansas fans, who are watching this raise up their hands and yell out hallelujah. No sugar huddle.
No sugar huddle. That was great to see. I think it seemed a little more, not as much weird stuff. I think
Yeah,
that for me, like, there wasn't much Wildcat. There wasn't as much of just the funky stuff that I think KU was doing with
yeah,
Koldenecki. And look, that stuff has a time and place. And I'd
sure.
actually argue that that type of stuff fits a bowl game better than it does a regular season game.
Yeah,
And this was actually the time for the weird stuff, right? Have fun in the bowl game, then maybe, you know, on a big play when you're going to have your running back throw the ball. Like, what the heck? So I think that it's funny that, the time when you're thinking, oh, things could get weird because it's a bowl game, it's actually the time when it didn't get weird, because I think Jim Zabrowski is maybe a little more, I don't know if pragmatic is the right word, but just not going to do some weird stuff. So I'll be fascinated to see. Obviously, Jeff Grimes was around the team during the bowl prep process. I saw him there. Side note, he's tall, he's big, he's a big guy. That was total side note, just walking by him in the hallway. But I'm fascinated to see kind of in spring ball, right, what KU changes offensively. But let's get to defense, Kevin.
Sure.
I think this was a great performance we talk about Jason Bean, right, capping his Kansas career with a really good game. I thought Kenny Logan, you have to give Kenny Logan a lot of credit, Kevin, because I think you and I sat on, or at least I sat here in this very chair and on this very podcast and talked about, maybe Kenny Logan a little overrated after last season. And I thought he really, really struggled last year and did not have a good year. And for him to come back and have the season that he had, where I thought across the board, every single game, he was one of KU's top 3 or 4 best defensive players. Consistency was there. His level of play, I think, was really stellar. And for him to end the bowl game as the defensive MVP, win a bowl game in his final game with Kansas, you think about all the things he's been through, whether it be the COVID season, the coaching transition, a down year last year, deciding to come back to Kansas. It's another one of these college football success stories that I just love. And I think it's such a great part of what makes college football so cool, that there are guys like this that maybe aren't going to have a huge NFL career ahead of them. The ability to have success in college, to impact winning and to impact a team turning it around. I think it's really cool that Kenny Logan, of all guys, was the guy that had this game and got that recognition. I just think it's cool.
When you think about 2000, the COVID year, and it seemed like that year Kenny Logan left every single game getting nicked up, right? It actually became, kind of a running joke or whatever a little bit, because, he get the wind knocked out of him, hurt his shoulder, whatever, leave for a few plays, and then he was back on the field. And he kept coming back out and kept coming back out for a team that went 0-9. And you think about going from how frustrating that had to be, where, they didn't have the pieces in front of him. So he was forced to make, pretty much every other tackle, it felt like. And, having to do that in a game where you're down 35 points isn't fun. When the running back breaks through again and you have to get him down again, and you're down big, and you're not going to win, and you're not really playing for anything, from a victory standpoint, that's not easy to do, and that's not fun for a player to do. He sticks around. One of the moments that I think about, and I can't remember if I put this in my article about Lance Leipold's rebuild or whatever in there, is Logan and Leipold just embracing after the Texas game. And after they upset Texas and Austin, and to get their second win of the season. And if you remember, Leipold said what he told Kenny Logan was basically like, okay, we have to push you even harder on Monday now. Yes, we got this win. It's great. Be happy for it. But this is just the start. We need to be more consistent, more deliberate, all of those things. And I think Lance Leipold and the staff kind of poured into Kenny Logan. And he came back. He had, some All-America mention preseason heading into 2022, certainly all Big 12 mention. And he had a bad year. He really did, and especially compared to what he had been the previous year. And then to come back, to rebound, all of the things that he did this year, like you said, to get defensive MVP and end his career the way that he did, was just another great story, and a heartwarming deal for a guy who had been through so much, at Kansas. It's not easy to go through a season where you don't win a single game. And if you remember that year, Kansas was only close in one game. So like it wasn't even the thing where it was like, man, we're so close, we're gonna break through.
No.
He had to buy into Lance Leipold's vision because there was nothing else there.
Mm.
And
Yep.
so,
Mm.
it was I think that's kind of a cool story. I'm glad you brought all that up.
Yeah, and I think too, right, there are other guys on defense that have that similar story. Rich
Sure.
Miller really developed. Um, I think he's one of the guys that is an important cultural guy on the team, and I
Yep.
think KU will miss that leadership that he brings on the field. I think other guys, you look at someone like Devin Phillips, man, watching him again, I think not forgot, but I think it just solidified how much of an underrated addition he was for KU
Sure.
and how solid he was. Just watching him take on double teams the whole game and be strong and sturdy, like KU will miss him next year. And you look at someone like Hayden Hatcher, the depth he provided and being a guy that, again, culturally was willing to put in the work and showed up every day, really ready to give it his all and really cared about Kansas. There are a lot of these stories, and obviously now Mello Dotson and Kobe Bryant have announced their return. KU gets
Yep.
both of them back. KU will have OJ Burrows and Marvin Grant expected to return as well. Jalen Dye can take a step forward this offseason. Like the secondary for KU next year is going to be really solid as long as they can continue to kind of keep it together. So I think that's a huge positive. But as it pertains for the bowl game, like I think it just continues to show that KU needs to get better at linebacker. Like that's kind
Yep.
of my big takeaway. And KU needs to find a defensive end in the transfer portal who can rush the passer because golly, they could not do that against UNLV, and it took some creative stuff with stunts and guys being able to get some added pressure in there, where it wasn't like during the season when KU kind of line up and send Austin Booker and Jeremy Robinson off the edge and get some pressure. They needed to get really creative to do it. Obviously, Austin Booker is going to go to the NFL, as of this Tuesday and now we're what, past 11 a.m. He's not announced anything, but I can tell you he is not going back to Kansas. He is going to go to the NFL draft. It's just a question of whenever he wants to make that announcement himself. So KU's got to find another defensive end in the transfer portal. Obviously, I think you and I are both very high on Deshaun
Yep.
Warner, Dak Brinkley, and what they are going to bring. But it's still freshmen, and you don't want to go into a season saying, man, we really hope these freshmen are ready to play from day one in the Big 12. Like, I don't think you want that. So that's a need. But generally, this defensive performance, I think it hones in the fact that next year KU secondary is going to be awesome. And the athleticism they're going to have at safety with OJ Burrows and Marvin Grant is going to be really good. And they've got two cover corners in Mello and Kobe that are going to be at the top of the Big 12. So I think that's an area to get really excited about for the defense and for folks that are on the VIP board and paying attention to our updates there. Linebacker and defensive line. Those are kind of the two big areas that KU has to get reinforcements at because of the NFL and the transfer portal. So, what do you think of the defensive performance, I guess, overall, Kevin?
Yeah, another guy that I thought really stood out, and I think he does a great job every week, but he does it in some kind of unsung roles, if you will.
Mm.
Craig Young had some monster
Yeah.
plays in this game, and it was great to see him go out that way because I think they do ask him to do a lot of really tough stuff where there aren't a whole lot of linebackers in the country that they ask to hey, go out and defend this slot receiver,
Mm.
and we're not going to give you a ton of help. We trust in your athleticism or whatever else. And I think sometimes people watch it and they're like, Craig Young's not really making a ton of tackles. He's not, really pressuring the quarterback that much. He's not making plays in the backfield. He's not really making an impact. But with what they ask him to do, that's a really tough deal. And for him to, he had the tackle for loss. He wound up with an interception as well. To have the big plays that he did were really good. I think
Yeah.
Jason Gilliard has a chance to be pretty good at that
Totally.
hawk spot. He obviously rotated through this year, had some good moments. Like you said, linebacker needs to clean stuff up, and it's not even just the starting guys necessarily that you project. I think they're going to need a little bit more depth as well, and depth of athleticism in that group. You talked about Devin Phillips, and I'm glad you did because I think when people put out their lists at the end of the year and 24/7 Sports, we've certainly done that. of the most impactful transfer guys, he's not going to show up, right? Because he's
No.
not going to tip the scale in terms of numbers or things like that. But when you talk about what a guy means to a defense, Kansas's defense was significantly better this year than it was a year ago. And not just overall, but you look at some of the key stops that they were able to make over the course of the season when Kansas had to have said stops, and Devin Phillips was a big part of that. And
Mhm.
as 1 year rentals go, or 1 year transfers, I think he made about as good an impact as he can. I'm interested with that defensive line group now. Like you said, they did not pressure
Mm.
UNLV very well at all, and so you look at that was one of the things that I think screamed out at me like, hey, and it wasn't even the lack of sacks. I think Kobe had the lone sack, right? It wasn't even the
Good
lack
play.
of yeah. It wasn't even the lack of sacks so much as the lack of pressure. They weren't making him uncomfortable. They weren't moving him out of the pocket
Mm.
or different things like that. I think, like you said, you got to go get a pass rusher, preferably somebody who's proven. And then you want to develop the guys you have. Guys like Dylan Brooks, they have some ability, and you want them to take that next step and be able to have a big season. But
Mm.
when you look at this game in particular and what it says moving forward, Kansas just didn't get pressure in this game.
Yep, exactly. So I think overall, this is something that I think KU, here's a good example of it, Kevin. I can't pull it up because we'll get, copyright stuff on this, and I like our YouTube channel, even if it's not even close to Kobe Bryant's YouTube channel in terms of subscriber numbers. Um, is you look at the first play from scrimmage for KU defensively, and Devin Phillips knocks back the guard, and it's a play to the left, and it's a 4-yard loss, and JB Brown is right there, just got to make a tackle. And he totally whiffs, and all of a sudden it's a big gain, and the ball gets rolling for UNLV. Like, that is an example, I think, of the impact guys on the defensive line can have and had this year, and the areas where KU has to get better next year, right? Guys like JB Brown, Cornell Wheeler, Tywone Berryhill have to get better just tackling. And I think that'll be a big point of emphasis, and that's something that this coaching staff, I think, is really good at. You've seen it over the course of time, right? Their first full off season, what was the goal? Hey, let's just get our defense installed so we're not having busted coverages and we can actually do things. And can we get our offense installed so we can actually run things? Then the next year, you saw some improvement, right? KU's defense was a little bit better. They made some plays, wasn't consistent, but there were some seeds there. And the offense blew up because they were able to have stuff happen. Then
Yeah,
last offseason, right, it was about physicality. Hey, let's not get pushed around every game. Let's make sure there are some games where we can push the opponent around. What happened? I think KU is a more physical team. And what? They played 13 games. I'd say probably 10 of those games, KU was the more physical team. You know,
yeah,
that's a huge improvement. And so now you look at, cool, I think broadly this team is set, right? The team knows what it's doing, and physically it's able to compete. So now you can focus on some of those more tackling's not intricate, but it's very specific, and say, okay, guys, like, we have to be better at tackling this year. For the offense, you could say, hey, we've got to be able to take on blocks a little bit differently on our offensive line, because when teams stack the box, we kind of struggled to get Devin Neal free. Like, there are another steps that you can take, and I think this coaching staff is so detail oriented that they'll be able to find ways to get improvement. So I think for me defensively, like, just tackling from the linebackers is going to be such a huge part, because the guys have to be in the right spots, and then they've got to be able to tackle. That's all you need from
yeah.
the linebackers. And so I think that's going to be a big point of emphasis this offseason.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's funny when defenses struggle, people tend to point to the defensive coordinator first, right? Like it's always that guy's fault. But all a defensive coordinator can do is put a guy in position. He can't make the
Mm-hmm.
play himself. He can put the guy. He can call the blitz that frees up the guy, and if the guy misses the sack, that's not the defensive coordinator's fault. And
Mm-mm.
so I think it's funny, and I'll be the first to say this. heading into this season, I was a wait and see still on Brian Borland, and
Hater.
I thought over the course of the season, he won me over quite a bit, and
Mm.
I think that even when Kansas had some defensive struggles, there were struggles where Kansas was generally in the right position, but didn't make a play.
Yeah. And I think that's the next big part, right? Getting playmakers. And that's where this high school recruiting comes into play. And we could talk more about roster construction and portal and all that next week. But I think just generally, you can see the vision with a lot of these guys,
Yeah,
like Ja'Cory Stewart at linebacker, right? Physical, fast, explosive athlete who can catch the ball when the ball's thrown to him.
yeah,
That's a big thing. You look at the defensive ends KU's bringing in. You can even look at last year's recruiting class. Guys like Jameel Croft, well, he was getting reps on special teams. Like for this coaching staff, that is how this progression works.
yeah,
You get time on special teams, and maybe you get like 5 to 10 reps on your respective side of the ball. And then maybe you're a part of the rotation a little bit more consistently. And someone like Jameel Croft being a true freshman playing on special teams is a huge deal. Keaton
yeah,
Quebeca played, I think, the first 2 snaps of the bowl game at wide receiver. Like, that's huge that he's already getting offensive snaps as a true freshman. So
yeah,
I think you just see this program starting to get kind of that ball rolling. It's a snowball, I think, a lot of times in college football where it's about talent acquisition through high school, making sure they're developed in the system so that they know what they're doing when they do take the field. And then they get 2 to 3 years of level of play. And maybe that's starting, maybe that's as a rotational piece. But I think, Kevin, one guy we have to talk about that we haven't talked about yet is Calvin Clements starting his
yeah.
first game at left
Sure.
tackle as a true freshman. I think we both talked about it when he committed. We thought, hey, it's going to take some time, right? Developmental guy, you know, playing in Kansas is not like playing in the Dallas area where you're going against 5 stars every week. And so I wasn't sure how it was going to go for him, but it's as soon as he got on campus in the spring of last year, he really started to impress. And I think for him to start the bowl game at left tackle as a true freshman, that's huge. What'd you think of the way that he played?
Yeah, I thought he played well. I thought you could see some rawness. You could see some freshman in him in a couple different ways. I think the strength needs to continue to improve. I thought there were a couple times where he made the block, got in position, didn't quite move his guy like maybe he will here in a year or two with another off season in the weight room. I thought some of his pass pro sets were maybe a little bit raw as well. But I say all that, and you want to know the reason that we didn't talk about him? We didn't notice him that much. And that's a great thing for an offensive line. I mean, Joe Posnanski wrote a column one time about Will Shields, the Chiefs Hall of Fame lineman. He said the best thing about Will Shields is you totally forget that he's even on the football field. He never gets called for penalties. He doesn't, get beat for big plays.
Mm,
You forget he's out there. And
yeah.
honestly, what, a quarter into that game, you're not thinking, hey, Calvin Clements is out there as a true freshman left tackle. He looked like he belonged.
Mhm.
He,
Yeah.
you weren't noticing him because he was missing a bunch of plays. And so I think, to me, like I said, I mean, yeah, there are things to clean up, to improve, whatever. But the biggest thing you can say is we didn't come out of that game saying, man, KU had a freshman at left tackle, though. No, I mean it wasn't a storyline, and I think that's about the most positive thing that you could say about him.
Yeah, I think you saw all the things that if you talk to people around the program that have people excited. It's the natural size. Like watching him
Yeah,
warm up next to KU's other offensive linemen, he looks different than the other guys KU has. That is a huge part. I think the
yeah,
movement ability for him, you saw at times when he's shuffling and sliding into pass pro, you can just see the way he moves that it's like, oh, wow, like this guy is a very fluid athlete at that size. So for him, it's just gonna be about getting in the weight room, getting bigger and
yep,
stronger. Because there were times when he would square a guy up with good technique and just wouldn't be able to drive him in the run
yep,
game. And that's a result of a guy being checks watch this time last year, playing at Free State. Like
yeah,
there's a big difference in the strength, and strength doesn't come in 1 year. Like that is a 2, 3 year thing where developing the strength and the power to be able to dominate guys in the trenches. And just for him to be able to hold his own, like you said, Kevin, and not be someone where you're like, oh my God, Calvin Clements is getting cooked every play. Like they've got to figure something out. They got to send Jared Casey over to his side or Mason Fairchild. Like the other guy that was getting cooked was on the right side, And so I think that's something that for KU is really positive in the long term, because I think if you talk to Calvin, he's a smart guy, he's cerebral, and he's going to figure it out in terms of the mental side, and he's going to put in the work. I have no doubt about that. So I think it's really exciting, and I'm fascinated to see what the left tackle competition looks like this offseason, because you got to say he's the favorite to start right now. I don't know if Logan Brown's going to be the guy that's going to take that job from him. So I think that's a really fascinating storyline for this offseason. Who wins the left tackle spot, and is Calvin Clements the guy? Because if so, Kevin, you're talking about a 4-year starter, right? Yeah. Maybe 3 if things go well and maybe he leaves early, but like that's kind of crazy to think about. That's like a Kima Deniji type of deal where he started out a necessity, and maybe it would be necessity next year, but like Clements is good enough to play at Kansas at this level, and next year with another full offseason, like I think he'd be perfectly fine as a starter.
I think did you say that Kubeka started the game?
I don't know if he started, but he played on the first drive a couple snaps.
Okay. The reason I asked is you look at Lance Leipold recruits, like guys that Lance Leipold has actually recruited, not in the transfer portal, but from high school.
High school,
guys
yeah.
who started for Kansas, I think, and I could be wrong on this, I think are Damon Greaves at punter and Calvin Clements at left tackle.
Yep.
And he's had multiple recruiting classes. So I mean that's not a knock on the other guys. I think we've talked about how old and experienced Kansas has been for multiple years now. Last year they led the Big 12 in number of starters coming back. This year, if you look at this year, when you look at like Bill Connolly at ESPN, his returning production numbers, Kansas led the country in returning production. And so for the last 2 years, Kansas has been incredibly old and experienced. And those are returning guys. Those aren't even counting the transfers you added in each of those classes. And so there hasn't been a need for Lance Leipold to tap into his high school guys yet from a starting standpoint on offense or defense. You've seen Mason Ellis on special teams. You've seen guys like that. And like you said, that's part of the process. But for Calvin Clements as a true freshman to get a start at left tackle, I think says quite a bit, especially when you look at the rest of the roster and say, okay, like young guys as of this point haven't really needed to step up or go into those spots. There hasn't been we have to start this guy out of necessity type deal, and Calvin Clements just got to start at left tackle. A huge position.
Yeah, right. It's like if you're going to tab your like most important positions in football, it's quarterback, it's left tackle, and I think it's probably defensive end. And to have someone so young with so much upside starting there is exciting for the long term and for the future of Kansas. So, Kevin, that's what I got on the bowl game. I think it's always a fascinating thing now because it gives you a look ahead to next year, and I think it's exciting to look a year from now and what KU could accomplish, right? I think health is going to be the biggest part for KU. I've covered it with that Iowa State team that returned a lot of guys, had the expectations to go to the Big 12 title game, and they got banged up in camp and never really found their form. So like injuries are going to be a big part of the next kind of, whatever. I guess we're in January now. It's so weird to say that, but over the next, 8 months, that's going to be a big, big key. And Jalen Daniels is going to be the guy that I think a lot of focus is put on, because I think a lot is going to ride on his availability next year.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get into, 2024 expectations, all those things, at another time. Mm-hmm. But closing the door on 2023 in this bowl game, Kansas came in, the number was 6, according to Las Vegas. I mean, that was the win total that was set for them. And if you remember, we were talking on this podcast about it. Was it DraftKings or somebody said one of the biggest,
I picked 7 wins, so I'm wrong. But yeah, you're
You
right.
picked
DraftKings had the
you
under.
picked 7, I think I picked 7 as well, but the Vegas number was 6, and I think it was DraftKings or one of those sites said that picking the under for Kansas was one of the most popular bets this year that they
Mhm.
had. And so a lot of people didn't even think Kansas would get to 6. And so, I look at it as obviously in a vacuum, 9 wins, huge success, first bowl win, huge success, all of these different things. I do think there's always going to be a little bit of an element of what if, though, because
Mhm.
I think if we're sitting here and we're being honest, there was a chance that Kansas was the second best team in the Big 12 this year to Texas. When you look at the fact that Kansas had a chance to win that game at Oklahoma State, led in the fourth quarter, made a lot of mistakes there. The 2 games that they lose by a total of 7 points to Texas Tech and Kansas State, where obviously, you're in a rough spot at the quarterback position and everything else. It reminds me a little bit, if Kansas plays Houston in basketball tomorrow, right? And somebody says to you beforehand, Kansas is going to be up 8 at halftime. You would take it every single day of the week.
Yeah.
Now, there's multiple ways to get that point. And if it's a really close game and it's like a 3-point game and Kansas pushes it up to 8 right before half, you're going in the locker room and you're high-fiving people and everything else. If you absolutely dominate the half and you're
Mm.
up like 18 and Houston cuts it down to 8 and you go into the locker room, it's a very different feeling. Would you take 8
Yeah.
heading in by 8? Absolutely. But there's different feelings for it. And so, in a vacuum, huge success this year. Obviously, getting to the wins that they did, all of those different things. I also think the way the year played out, the fact that they had those chances to
Mm.
maybe sneak into the Big 12 title game, all of those different things. I think there's always going to be a little bit of that, what if or man, it could have been even better than it was. What do you think?
Yeah, I tend to agree. I'd also say I think there are a lot of college football teams that are gonna say, "Yeah, oh, well, if these 2 moments had gone our way, we'd have 2
Sure.
more wins." I think that's kind of the nature of college football when you have a competitive
K
product,
State could have K
right?
State could have beaten Texas, like K State lost to Texas in
Yeah.
overtime, and so as much as and the reason I bring that up is, Kansas fans point to that K State game a lot as, oh, if we had Jason Bean, never mind Jalen Daniels, we win that game by double digits or whatever. K State could turn around and say, well, we could have beaten Texas, and around we go.
And the nice part is, though, Kevin, at the end of the day, the nice part is we can have this conversation at this point
Sure.
of the year, right? We're not recording this podcast, December 2nd, talking about, oh, well, 3 wins for Kansas. All right. I mean, who are they going to hire as the next head coach? Like, it's good to be able to have these conversations that I think a lot of other college football programs can have now, where you're playing competitive football week in and week out. And there are games that are going to happen in the course of a football season that are going to be close and they're going to involve moments that don't go your way. And there are other ones that are going to involve moments that do go your way and you're going to win a close game, as a result. So I think generally, like, it's a net positive that 2 years ago, if you would have said, "Hey, KU's going to win 9 games," you say, "Oh my god, like what?"
Oh
Like, that's
yeah.
great.
Yeah.
That's incredible. And I think it speaks to the place that Lance Leipold, the coaching staff, and the players have this program, that we can sit here and have this conversation now, right? And
Oh
say,
yeah.
"Oh man, well, two bounces the ball. If Trevor Wilson doesn't fumble it, or muff the punt, KU beats K State, and all of a sudden, you're looking at maybe a 10-win season. It's it's good that KU football is in this place. And you're right. Like, there are moments in the season that you say, man, if that had gone KU's way, maybe they are playing in the Pop Tarts Bowl, which I'm so pissed off about, Kevin. I'm
Oh,
so pissed that they didn't go to the Pop Tarts Bowl. That would have been
I
electric
was gonna say
factory. But
I was gonna say I saw a bunch of K State fans on Twitter, talking about the viewership numbers and you
oh
know, oh yeah, everybody tuned into our bowl, and I just wanted to be
no,
like, they tuned in for the Pop Tart, it wasn't even the football part of it. It was the fact that we killed a Pop-Tart on live TV, and then they wound up eating it. But it's back to your original point. When
You got me
Kansas,
crying, Kevin. It's so absurd that a Pop-Tart.
a Pop-Tart died so that we could live.
Oh my God. Oh,
But
it's so ridiculous. I love college football.
Oh yeah, it was absolutely amazing. And it's funny, you think about, I mean, obviously it's not free advertising, they paid to sponsor it, but the amount of advertising that Pop-Tarts got, and the amount of chatter that Pop-Tarts got from sponsoring that bowl was just off the charts. But you look at the year before Lance Leipold arrived, which was, I get that it was a COVID season. It was weird. There were only 9 games. Teams didn't have full rosters. In that season, Kansas they went 0-9, and they only had 1 game that was separated by 1 score when they lost to Texas Tech in the season finale. So you're sitting here right now, we're talking about, okay, you got to 9, maybe they could have gotten to 11 or whatever. In that year, you're sitting there saying KU was at 0, maybe they could have gotten to 1. So yeah, I mean, there's a major difference in that feeling and everything else. But as great as the Pop-Tarts Bowl was, and it was a cultural touchstone moment for those of us in college football. I think Kansas will likely have its sights set on an even bigger bowl game heading into next year, and I know that potentially even with the expansion, the college football playoffs. So that'll be something to watch. And I just know if I'm the college football playoff, I try to get the Pop-Tarts Bowl one of those bowl games.
That would be elite viewing. But yeah, Kevin, we can talk about all that. We got a long off season ahead.
Sure.
Long off season ahead. So I think next week we'll talk about the portal, who KU's lost, obviously, so far, right, as we were finishing up recording. It's Spencer Lovell, Armajé Reed Adams, both going in the portal. I don't think Armajé is in yet. I can check real quick. Yeah, not yet. The expectation is that he'll go in today. But yeah, next week talk about portal, and then we can probably get into more off-season-y topics soon after. But Kevin, I've enjoyed doing these podcasts with you. Excited to keep things rolling. Obviously, for folks that are watching on the YouTube channel, thanks as always for liking and subscribing to the channel. Make sure you're doing both those things, dropping comments. All of that stuff helps us reach more KU fans so we can continue to get this channel to grow. So maybe one day, Kevin, we can get to as many YouTube subscribers as Kobe Bryant. For folks watching on
this is going to be a thing. This is going to be a thing.
Oh, it is. It is the race to match Kobe, and we're never going to get there. Or maybe one day. But for folks listening on their podcast platform of choice, make sure you're leaving ratings, reviews. Again, those do go a long way in helping us reach more KU fans. For Kevin Flaherty, I'm Michael Swain. Thanks as always for listening to the Fog.net podcast. We'll be back next Sunday with another podcast.